Okay, so this video is likely to be a rather short one because I'm going to be taking a look at Lothlorien in MOS, and as anyone who's played MOS knows, Lothlorien are a pretty small faction in terms of the amount of units they have. They're pretty much a sort of stripped out version of the Woodland Realms and the High Elves. That's the sort of thing we're going to be looking at here, but they've got some decent stuff, so it is worth taking a look at what they have to offer, and also they're one of the few factions that I have left to cover in MOS before we get to the final one, which I intend to be Mordor. So I will set up the composition and we'll take a look at them. So here we have an overhead of Lothlorien's relatively small roster, although you will see quite a lot of parallels with the High Elves in particular as we go through this, particularly with the elite infantry. But again, this is kind of like a sort of mix of the High Elves and the Woodland Realms in terms of what sort of units we have available. There are some similarities with the Sylvan Elves of vanilla as well, but we will start at this end with the lower tier elven units. But again, in MOS there's not really such thing as low tier elves. With the Lorien Sentinels, this is kind of a forest wardens type unit that was in vanilla. They're a sword and shield unit. Despite the fact that they look like they have very light armor, just these cloaks, they are exceptionally good in melee. Of course, all the elven units, particularly with Lothlorien, are over 1,000 florins. Lothlorien are a very expensive faction. Overall, they might even be a little bit more expensive than the High Elves. But nonetheless, these guys are very, very good indeed. If you play campaign in MOS, of course, you'll be starting off with some very, very nice units. I will say, of course, that arrows are probably going to be these guys' biggest weakness, but then with Lothlorien you have the ability to field archers, which are going to be far better than anyone else's anyway, so you're going to win any sort of skirmish you start. The only problem you're going to have is with numbers, and that's sort of a macro look at the Lothlorien army as well, because numbers are really going to be your only weakness, because in terms of overall quality of units, you're going to be outperforming your opponent, unless of course you're up against another elven faction, which means you're pretty much going to be cancelling one another out in terms of quality. But then, of course, you don't have to deal with the enemy having greater numbers than you. So, swings and roundabouts. Very basic unit, the Lorien Sentinels, but very good. Then, of course, we have the Lorien Spearmen. This is basically the Sylvan Spearmen of this submod. They basically have the same unit model. They're a pretty nice looking unit, I have to say. I do like their shields, and I like the fact in vanilla the Sylvan Elves had a lower tier spear unit that they could use. I felt that was always something they had over the High Elves, and while this is still technically the case because of the Lorien Spearmen, and I do like that, I do appreciate that. But when you're playing as the elves, of course, what is really important to you is going to be your high tier infantry. The quality is what's going to carry the day, and we have here the Galadrim Spears, which of course you can tell by their armor and their overall look that they are the new Sylvan Heavy Spearmen. And of course they will perform in exactly the same way as like the Eldar Spears. And as they always were, they're not really going to die terribly easily as long as they're pointing towards the enemy, I should say. Because they still have their shield wall formation, which is very, very important. If you're against these guys, really what you're going to want to be doing is outflanking them. Otherwise, you don't really want to take a straight up fight with them because they will really just stand there all day. The only thing that will really be able to out attrition them would be pikes that are in formation, and that's going to be a very, very long fight indeed. So that is the spears, still as good as they always were. And of course, now there is this new unit, which wasn't in vanilla. We went over this with the High Elves, with the Eldar Guards. These are the Galadrim Guards, and this is the Sword and Shield unit, which the Sylvan Elves really did need, gotta be honest, in vanilla, because whereas the High Elves always had the Smiths and the Mithlond Nobles, the Sylvan Elves didn't really have a high tier Sword and Shield unit, and the Sword and Shield units are a very powerful unit in Medieval too, in terms of the mechanics of how things work. So having this unit will help them a great deal. Of course, in terms of the multiplayer balance, you're going to be at a pretty big disadvantage with the elves, regardless of what you do. But it is very nice to have a unit like this in the elven faction because they will get a lot of work done, and they are still very, very tough to kill. Nice shields, of course. We still have the Galadrim swords, which again, this is the Sylvan Heavy Swordsman. The shock infantry is a lot better in MOS simply because of the survivability of all the units. So this is a unit which is actually going to be very, very important to you when playing as the Sylvan Elves, or well, I should say Lothlorien now. Yeah, very, very nice unit indeed. I wasn't really a huge fan of these guys in vanilla simply because the Sylvan Elves, they seem to die off too easily, and the Sylvan Elves really need to keep their units alive for longer simply because they have less in the unit, and this is still the case, but you know, I think they've gotten a good buff, and that's very important for the Sylvan Elves. They have a nice damaging infantry unit in melee. The general unit for Lothlorien are the Sindar Archers. Again, of course, they have the same armor as the elite infantry. Now, there's only 40 of them, but their accuracy is dead on, so they are worth it, and also they are the only unit, I believe, in the Sylvan Elven roster which is below 1,000. I think they're 800 florins. So it's worth getting the general units in this mod, if only because it does help you save a little bit on the money, as the elves anyway. And they are also very, very accurate, of course. Then we have the Lorien Archers, again, sort of a lower tier archer unit, if there is such a thing, for the elves. Pretty much the same sort of look as the two other Lorien lower tier units over here. So yeah, very, very nice, but again, Elven Archers in this mod are so much better than all the others, it's unreal. So, yeah, very good for a lower tier unit, but if you want something a little bit more beefy, we have the Rangers of Lorien, which they look exactly the same, so that's something. But the Rangers of Lorien, again, pretty much the Sentinels of the Woodland Realms, and that was always a very, very good unit. They all look the same, it's very uncanny. The faces remind me of Morrowind, actually, now that I come to think of it. Now, though, we of course have the Galadrim Archers, and the Sylvan Heavy Archers were always, in my opinion, the best archer unit in vanilla. This is still kind of the case, because with Lothlorien your archers are a little bit more important than as the High Elves, because of course the High Elves still have that very high tier infantry unit. So in campaign I would suggest that your archers are going to make up the bulk of your army, just so that you can mow down units as they approach you with relative ease. Of course, in online, your archers are going to be very, very important. Custom rules are necessary, but, you know, you can make Lothlorien work online, provided you leverage your archers, same as the Sylvan Elves in vanilla. But of course, the mechanical changes in MOS make balance pretty difficult to achieve in multiplayer. Then we have the Lorien Lancers. Now, we don't have a horse archer unit with the Sylvan Elves anymore, which is kind of strange, but they do have a cavalry unit, which has lances. Now, of course, this isn't going to be a match for example, the High Elven cavalry unit, but nonetheless, this is still a shock cavalry unit with their lances and their shields, which means they're pretty decent against archers, and it is very, very important that you use these guys very well, because you're going to need some sort of mobility in your army, because most of your core is going to be pretty static in terms of defending your archers and holding back the hordes of orcs likely that you're going to be facing. We of course have the Bjornings. This is the one unit you have in your roster which is pretty much affordable. They're like 480 florins. You can have 4 before the cost increases, so this is going to be sort of the meat shield of your army. They're pretty good, honestly. Like, as far as a cost-efficient unit goes, they are very, very nice to use, I must be honest. But, again, like, I would suggest that their real weakness is, of course, archers. They don't really wear armor, they don't have shields, so you're going to have to be wary of enemy archers there. And moving on to the final unit that the Sylvan Elves have available, and this is a unit that you're honestly not going to be able to use most of the time, partly because they're overpowered, and partly because they crash the game, and that is of course the Ents. Now the Ents are basically hyper-powered trolls in the way that they function. They are a little bit more vulnerable to fire arrows, obviously, they're trees, but you know, their stats are pretty ridiculous. They have 8 hit points, they have an enormous amount of attack, 5, I mean, you know, obviously their charge is enormous as well. It's something you're not going to be able to use in the vast majority of cases, mainly because they are actually no more expensive than a lot of your infantry, which, you know, proves that the balancing is a little bit off. And also the fact that they tend to crash the game, I've noticed. I did try to use them once in a little custom thing that I was doing just to test them out, and they crashed it because both armies were full. And that is a bit of a problem, which it's kind of a shame because I do like the Ents. They're pretty similar in power, I would say, to the Mumakil, although the Mumakil are a little bit easier to hit with the Ballista, which is why I think the Mumakil aren't maybe quite as overpowered as these guys. But, you know, can't really be helped. But, you know, it's nice to see them, because most of the time units like this, you never really get to see them in online because of how strong they are. But yeah, that's the Ents. And that is Lothlorien as a whole. So it's very similar really to the High Elves, only they have a couple more archer units and they have the Ents. And they have sort of slightly lower tier units in places. So yeah, that is Lothlorien, and we are running a little low on factions to do in MOS, which is probably a good thing because, you know, these are just shorter videos that I do. And I am actually thinking of revamping the videos that I do for when Reforged comes out. I want to improve them. So if anyone's got any suggestions to how I can improve it, just leave it in the comments and I'll give them a read. And, you know, for when Reforged comes out, hopefully I can make my videos a little bit better because, you know, I'd like to make them better. I'd like to improve as I go. So I hope you enjoyed this, and next I think we'll do, well, I don't know actually, I need to actually have a look at what factions I've got left. I know I've got the Misty Mountains and Mordor left, and that's the only ones I can think of off the top of my head actually, which is interesting. Maybe Eriador as well actually. So we might do the Misty Mountains, then Eriador, then Mordor. If those are the only three that I've got left, I'll do them in that order. And then we can prepare for when Reforged comes out, and I'll do bigger and better videos, hopefully. And I hope to see you then.